Okay, so another exciting video. This one is about species counterpoint, and more specifically, an introduction to counterpoint. So we're going to be going over some definitions and some terms to help us understand a sort of foundation and get us familiar with certain things that will help us have less confusion during the later lessons that will develop into species counterpoint, starting with the first video on one-to-one counterpoint. So before we get into those terms, let's actually just look at some counterpoint real quickly, and by looking at it, just analyzing the nature of it. So as you can see here, there is these notes that I dotted in red, and the reason why I dotted them in red is because I'm emphasizing the fact that these are a bottom voice. This is a work by Bach. This is the Partita 3, and this is the first minuet. So as you can see how this is notated helps, because in the case of when there's two notes, as you can see, there's a note on the top and there's that note on the bottom, and the note on the top has a stem going up, and the note on the bottom has a stem going down. And you can see that when there is a note on the bottom and the top, or a note that would take up the space of the top space, then you have a note going down on the bottom and a note going up on the top. And sometimes when there is not that lower voice, you have this note that's up here just going down like it normally would be. But we want to be looking at these red notes right now, okay, the counterpoint. And we want to be seeing that these are not just chords, these are not just harmonizations, but this is a well planned out counterpoint. In other words, this is a well planned out set of two different lines. There's a bass line to the melody that's going right here. And then there's the upper voice of the melody that's up on the top of it. And this is a solo violin work, but it is giving the impersonation that there are two players because there are two voices. So let's just stop and think about the fact that if a writer takes time to carefully write a contrapuntal section, in other words, a section that has multiple voices, multiple melodies going on, then if a player is able to, with good skill, read that and play it well, then with that combination you can make extremely intricate and beautiful music, with the ability of the player being able to read and play what you are scoring, and also for the composer to be able to sit down and carefully and considerably spend time on a counterpoint line that functions well and is also playable on the instrument. Okay, so as we go further along in this movement, we can see that there is quite a good amount of counterpoint. And I think this is a great example because you can have some complicated counterpoint to where you can have up to 4 or 5 voices, and in something like a fugue, a lot more complicated things will be happening. But here, for the most part, we have an upper voice and a bottom voice. In other words, we have just 2 voices. And as we progress along, he does add a third voice in here, which I mark as I keep the bottom voice marked in that red dot on the bottom, and then I start putting a green dot in there, representing the fact that this is that third voice. We're not going to get into the function of these voices in this video. We're just going to highlight the fact that the music can have more than one voice going on, and this is the whole nature of counterpoint. As we go further along, we can see he adds a 4th voice in here, and I just put in yellow just to show you that, yeah, we have 1, 2, 3, 4. Then we return to 2 voices. So in any case that there's a very bottom voice, I'm just keeping that very bottom voice as the red dot, as you can see. Okay, so I think you get the point. So let's listen to the piece. And as you're listening to it, I want you to consider what I just talked about with the 2 different voices, sometimes more, but mainly pay attention to the fact that there's this upper voice and there's this bottom voice, and the fact that they're not just harmonizing together. In other words, they're not just things that sound nice together, but instead you literally have 2 different melodies playing at the same time. And a good thing to think about is the fact that counterpoint has the ability to have 2 different melodies that are both competing to be heard at the same time, with one that is not dominating more than the other one. And this goes along to when you add more voices in, but I'm just going to start with talking about 2 voices from the beginning. And this is different than in a lot of songs. You have, let's say, some instruments and they're laying down maybe like a bass line, then some other instruments are playing a melody on top of that. You could describe that as the melody is dominating and you're hearing that, and then you're also hearing the other instruments as accompaniment, which sit more in the foreground, helping with the harmony and the texture of what is going on at the moment. So now that we have a good understanding of counterpoint in these two different voices, let's first listen to this, and then we're going to get into these terms and definitions and talk about this a little more. Okay, so I'm going to play that much. I'm going to talk just a little bit here. I don't want any copyright, but I'm going to keep playing it after the repeat sign because normally it would just repeat that again. Okay, so sorry, but that's all I'm just going to give you just because, again, I don't want that copyright. So now let's go on to the definitions. Okay, so now let's go over some terms to help us understand the topic. First, we have the term homophony, where a dominant sound is accompanied by a background support such as a harmony, chords, or some sort of support that helps accompany the dominant sound. So like I was describing before, you have that melody going on, and then you have instruments in the background, and they're helping the background of that melody. So this can mean harmonizing, but this can also mean the use of non-harmony notes to create dissonance. It's just saying that there's one player that's more dominant, the one that's actually doing the melody, and then there are other instruments creating sort of the background. So on the other hand, we have polyphony, and that ties more into this video. Poly means multi or many. When multiple melodies are competing simultaneously and are both heard to be on top, compared to homophony, where you have a dominant sound on top and an accompaniment on the bottom. The goal of counterpoint is to have polyphony while portraying musical interest as well as elegance. So now let's get into the actual definition of counterpoint. Counterpoint is a Western music system that lays out set rules and guidelines to help create polyphony that sounds nice as well as interesting. But more importantly, allows for a distinct separation of music melodies that are still competing to simultaneously be dominant, while at the same time sounding nice and also musical together. They should sound like they are conversating with each other, but in their own distinct voice. The goal is to make the voices as distinct or as separate as possible while still sounding nice. Species counterpoint, a method of teaching counterpoint that isolates the fundamentals of counterpoint into separate lessons to be able to teach it from a simple level all the way to a complex level. This allows the student to have a deep understanding of counterpoint. Doing the exercises for each of these lessons will help train you to know how to follow and master the rules of counterpoint. Okay, so most of the information comes from Jacob Grand's YouTube videos about counterpoint. He's teaching from the book Gradus Parnassum. Sorry if I didn't pronounce that correctly. This is from the 1720s. Beethoven is said to have held this book at great esteem. It is also documented that Mozart's father taught Mozart from this book, and also Haydn worked out each one of the exercises from this book. These are just a few of the great composers that were taught from or studied this book. Some of the information also comes from Bach to the Basics YouTube videos about counterpoint, as well as my own personal further research. Different types of species counterpoint. One-to-one, also known as first species counterpoint, is one note against one note. Cantus firmus and the counterpoint move in the same note durations, creating a one-to-one ratio of notes. This can also be called note against note counterpoint. The notes can be whole notes, half notes, quarter notes, and so on, as long as they follow the 1-to-1 ratio rhythm. 2-to-1 or second species counterpoint is 2 notes in the counterpoint and 1 note in the cantus firmus. 4-to-1 or sometimes 3-to-1 is third species counterpoint. 4 notes or sometimes 3 notes in the counterpoint and 1 note in the cantus firmus. So third species counterpoint has 4 notes to 1 or 3 notes to 1. Okay, so now fourth species counterpoint may not be what you expect. The melodies in the cantus firmus and the counterpoint are offset metrically from each other. This causes the melodies to overlap in ways that are different from species 1, 2, and 3. And now fifth species counterpoint, sometimes called florid counterpoint, uses all four of the species together in order to create a more musical, more realistic sound. One that would sound more like actual music.